Good evening. Brian Eno is an artist in so many genres I had to write him down. He's a musician, he's a composer, he invented ambient music, he's a producer of all the great albums you've ever seen, he's an installation artist who's worked all over the world. He's a political activist, and I would say not a right-winger. He's an author. He's been a Long Now board member from the very beginning. He named the foundation and the clock Long Now. 10 years ago, the occasion for tonight, he was the first SALT speaker. He co-designed with Danny Hillis, and they are still working on the chimes for the 10,000-year clock. He came and did an installation piece called 77 Million Paintings, and he is now working on, when the salon opens, for our museum and bar and office and everything else thrown together at Fort Mason, he will be doing the music and visuals for that place. So in a sense, you could say that one of Brian Eno's genres is Long Now. Danny Hillis is an incredibly prolific inventor. Yes, massive parallel processing, which is the way computation happens. Whenever you use your smartphone with this gesture, Danny invented that. The MetaWeb, which made Google search intelligent as well as brilliant, was bought by Google and makes your Google search sensible. He came up with the concept of proteomics, which is a way to basically use massive data of the body to eventually cure cancer. Why not? What's interesting is that he's prolific and he's fast. He's gone through so many inventions, it's a tiny sample I just went through. Dozens, hundreds, patents galore. But one invention just keeps going on. 20 years ago, he started inventing the 10,000-year clock of the Long Now, and he just keeps inventing it. You know, is it a difficult problem? Is it an interesting problem? What is it that would make a musician or an inventor keep bearing down on one body of creativity? Tonight we'll find out. Brian Eno, Danny Hillis.
Good evening. The piece of music you heard was played for a reason, actually. Danny and I have been on one of our road trips for the past few days. Every year or two, we go for a drive in the desert where he drives and I sit and listen to him talk. No, it's not exactly like that. We have long conversations, and the little box in the front of the car keeps saying, make a legal U-turn as soon as possible, because we consistently get lost. Even though we have 2 GPS systems in the car, we don't pay attention to either of them. But during these trips, we talk about what we're thinking about, and what I'm thinking about at the moment is a new record that I'm just finishing, of which that is the last track. And as you can hear, that track is quite long, and I kept thinking as I was listening to it in the car, this should be longer. It already got expanded quite a lot. That end part started out as 8 bars long. And it's now about 120 bars long. And I think it needs to double or so. And I was thinking, as I was doing that, why am I wanting to make it so long? Why do I want it to be that long? And I guess it's because I don't want there to be any mistake that that's what I meant to do. I don't want somebody to think that I just accidentally made it long. That I wasn't paying attention, or I forgot to do an edit or something like that. I want it to be very clear that it is meant to be a long piece of music that sort of stays in the same place for a long time. So I was thinking about that and thinking about how commitment is something that you register in a piece of work. You register what somebody has committed themselves to. And I remembered back to time when I first heard about the clock, about Danny's clock. I already knew Danny then, but not very well. And Stuart told me about this idea for a clock. And my first thought was, well, why would you go to all the trouble of building a thing like that? It's a very complicated problem, to try to imagine something that's going to last for 10,000 years with all the things that could happen to the world in that time. And I was thinking, why would you bother to do that? Though I sort of like the idea too. But I was thinking, why don't you just sort of spread the rumor that you have actually done it? Sort of save yourself a lot of trouble, But then over the years, I started thinking, no, it was actually important to do it. To actually try to realize this thing was part of the message, to try to actually make it become real. And to be faced with all the difficulties of doing that was part of what the thing was about. So not being virtual was part of it. We were talking quite a lot about virtuality and virtualization. And there's this wonderful theory by, I think his name is Geoffrey Miller, is it, or Gregory Miller? I can't remember the man's name, who theorized that the reason we'd never heard from any other cultures in the universe was not because they didn't exist, but because at a certain level of development, all cultures got lost in their own ability to virtualize experiences. So basically they ended up eating and masturbating and not bothering to communicate with anyone else. So virtualization is something that we do, and it's a sort of internalization of experience. And I think part of this was the want to externalize something. Sorry, darling. Anyway, so about almost 20 years ago now, the Long Now Foundation started. And of course, Danny and his clock were at the center of that. So maybe you'll start by telling the audience a little bit about that.
Well, it occurs to me that getting lost is something that we actually do very well together.
Yeah, we're very good at losing ourselves.
Yeah, the reason the GPS is always saying to turn around is because we get into a conversation, and several times we've gone hundreds of miles out of our way. I remember particularly the trip up from San Francisco to Monterey, where we ended up in Sacramento while we were. It was the whole time, this GPS telling us to please make the next legal U-turn. But that's actually kind of a metaphor, though, because there's another thing that happens on these trips, which is because we usually don't start off these trips with any place in particular in mind that we're going, and we just have some time set aside. And the GPS is actually very good for giving you instructions to get to some place, and that little map can kind of show you where your next left turn is and so on. But generally, we actually have no idea where we're going.
Yeah.
And so what usually happens is after a couple of days of sort of frustratingly looking at this little tiny map, we finally get discouraged, and we go over by the side of the road, and we find somebody who sells a big paper map. And it's this sort of moment when we open up the map of Nevada or Arizona or something, and all of a sudden it sort of feels like we're in this much bigger world, that we get out of that little world of the GPS and we're in this. And there are all these places that we will never go, and that really, in some sense, it's not that useful to navigate by, but somehow there's this sense of relief of we're in this bigger context and all the possibilities of where we might go or where we could go. And in a sense, I think that's what the Long Now Foundation is for, is it's sort of that in time of all of the normal things that we do are kind of like the GPS. We have a goal and we have little instructions to turn left and right, and that's our normal mode of thinking, is that little view to get someplace. And every day we do that, and it's really nice to have some excuse to kind of step back and look at a much bigger space and kind of imagine all the places that we might go, even if we're not going to. And so the Long Now Foundation, I think, is really an excuse to do that. And sometimes I think we slip in with to the Long Now Foundation, I think we slip into coming across as if we're trying to convince people to think longer term. But I don't think it's that prescriptive. I think it's actually much more an excuse for us to be able to have a conversation that's a different kind of conversation than we normally have. And for example, these trips we go on, and I think many of the activities along now get us into different kinds of conversations. So I'm hoping that's what will happen tonight, is we'll have one of these kind of long now-ish conversations. Maybe not quite like the ones we do on the road trip, because those often have like an hour that goes by while we think about something the other one says without saying anything.
After an hour or something.
Right.
No, I actually don't agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like a very slow chess game. It's fun if you're doing it, but
Yeah, never mind, I take that back.
I was wrong.
But this notion of a conversation, I think, is kind of, in some sense, I'm starting to see it as one of the greatest possibilities we have to contribute to the future, is if we can start a thread of conversation.
Yeah.
Maybe a different.
Yeah, so one of the things when I talk about art and about the practice of art, I often use the word conversation, because I think that you never see a piece of art on its own. You never see it free from the rest of the conversation that you know to date. So if you look at a painting, and you've looked at a lot of paintings, as most of us have, you look at that painting in relation to that whole conversation of paintings. So we're constantly engaged in conversations, and what you see when you look at a new painting is the similarities and differences to all the other paintings you've seen. So some paintings, of course, are completely meaningless out of that kind of context. You know, if you think of Kazimir Malevich's White on White, it's hardly a picture, actually, if you think about it. But it is an important picture in relation to the history of painting until that point.
Do you know about my white on white painting? I actually have my bones removed and replaced with titanium, and then I grind up the
to make that white.
And I make the white pigment out of my own bones.
Yeah, that's very old-fashioned, actually. I mean, my white-on-white paintings are really there because I'm a Zen Buddhist, and they represent for me nothingness. So I think nothing is much more important than your bones, actually.
Well, well, I was talking about my old ones. My new ones, I buy Dutch masters at auctions at tremendous cost, and then I paint them over with white acrylic. And the art world is completely scandalized by this.
Yeah, that's a very good idea, though. Funnily enough, I bought one of yours and painted it over white.
But I know, I actually made a loving recreation of that, but I hang it upside down.
But lately, I mean, all this kind of conceptual art is fun, but I've gone figurative lately, and I'm now painting snow scenes.
Very retro of you.
Yeah, it's very but they're accurate. They're perfectly white. In fact, I'll show you one later. I've got a few examples here. In fact, I can just hold one up for the audience to see that.
Oh, right.
Have you seen that one before?
Actually, it's very funny, because mine, I did the same thing much smaller, but put a big border around it.
I like the border idea. Back to the more serious issue of this evening, however. So what interests me is how cultural objects like white paintings and so on help us form our notions about things. And Stuart Brand, who introduced us, was very alert to that when, in the late 60s, I guess it was, or the early 70s, he started a campaign to release, for NASA to release the picture of the whole Earth, the first picture of the Earth taken from space. And the point about an image like that is that it changes the way you think about things. So the clock of the long now is really supposed to be that kind of mythic, metaphorical presence, something that would make you think differently, perhaps. And I had an example of how powerful this can be about, I don't know, nearly 20 years ago now. I went to the British Museum. I had a friend working there who was the curator of the Egyptian department. And he said, you should come sometime and look downstairs because we've got tons of stuff in the basement that we never show. And indeed, the basements of the British Museum snake out under a large part of London, and they're filled with the antiquities that we successfully looted from Egypt over a period of several hundred years. And he took me around. There were shelves and shelves of dusty artifacts. And on one shelf, there was a tiny little bronze casting, not more than 1.5 inches long. And it was of a mother cat feeding 4 kittens. And this was done with incredible precision and care and real love, you know. And it was 4,000 years old. And looking at that thing, I suddenly knew more about the Egyptians than in all the reading I'd ever done. Because I suddenly realized here was a people who 4,000 years ago were fond of pets, could have a loving relationship with a pet in the way that we're used to doing. This is something we tend not to imagine about people 4,000 years ago. So in that one object, I think I had more of a feeling for Egyptian culture than all the huge things I'd seen, the pyramids and the Sekhmets and the Vizier of Memphis and so on. And sometimes I think an object, once it's in existence, can have that effect on you. And that's what works of art do, I think. And so I think the way we think about the clock now is possibly more as a work of art than as a functioning machine, although it is a functioning machine, or will be. And, of course, Danny...
I think of it more as a functioning machine, yeah.
Do you?
But I mean, I don't know exactly. I mean, if by art you mean the conversation, then yeah, I suppose it's a conversation piece.
Yeah, it's a conversation piece. So it's sort of really meant to introduce a conversation, I think, isn't it? It's there and it starts you talking about it. I mean, what I notice when I talk to people about the clock is they say, well, that's a pretty daft idea. I mean, how can you know what's going to happen in 3,000 or 5,000 years' time? And, of course, and then we start talking about that. And after a little while, they realize that they are starting to do something that they've never done before very often, which is to think about the distant future. So it does start the conversation.
Should we actually try to talk a little? And the interesting thing about trying to talk over that time frame, of course, is that you really can't imagine it. But
yeah.
Trying to is fun. And there are a few kind of standard imaginations of the future over really long time frames. One of which is the kind of Earth becomes a garden, and there's poets and artists and things who are all watched over by machines of loving grace, and kind of the robots taking care of them. And
then the other one's the road.
Yeah, the kind of, yep. And so that's the one where we sort of fail to solve. So there's one of them, at one end there are these sort of utopias where we imagine we solve all of our problems completely, and then our biggest problem is boredom. And the other end of the spectrum is that we imagine we don't solve our problems and we somehow fail to, and we end up with The Road or Mad Max or some dystopia of everything falling apart. That's the one that seems to be more popular in science fiction these days.
Yeah.
And actually, my guess is that the truth is probably neither of those. That probably, if you look backwards, what's happened is humanity has always had new challenges and always kind of risen to the occasion, met those challenges, and that meeting those challenges was living, and then by the time they met those, there were more, and so on. So you had a series of challenges. And my assumption is actually that that's probably what the next 10,000 years are going to be like. We're going to have lots of challenges. They're going to be really big problems like global warming, and we'll figure out ways of solving those. And there'll be probably social challenges. I mean, I think we've got a huge one coming up of, for instance, distribution of wealth. I just read that the 85 richest people in the world actually own half the wealth in the world.
Wow.
So, that's clearly something that is I don't think that's a stable situation.
Yeah, it's a good guess, yeah.
But how do we, but so, there are challenges like that, but we're going to have to figure out ways of setting things up, ways of relating to each other, ways of, having our culture, our economic systems, our political systems, things like that. And
Yes,
I suspect it will be a series of.
Well, a lot of what will happen in the future depends on what people expect to be about to happen. So I think it makes a huge difference if you think that you live in a time where the graph is going up, as we did in the 60s, or in a time where the graph is going down, as it seems my daughter's generation do. I mean, generally, they don't seem to expect things to be better. They don't seem to expect that they'll be able to just float on a cloud and probably find a job if they're lucky and not bother if they're not. So to me, it seems to be that at the moment there's a kind of expectation that things are getting slightly worse, not dramatically, but slightly worse. I think if people start to think that things are going to get much worse, then a very dangerous feedback spiral starts. A kind of, the survivalists are the good example of this. People who think that the future is self-defense and making a safe corner for yourself and fighting everybody else off. That is not a generous future. So one of the reasons this is important to think about, actually, is to try to see whether that's realistic as a future picture, whether, in fact, we can come up with a slightly more upbeat one. So,
when I grew up, I guess this universal assumption was everything was getting better. And people, I think, in retrospect, were pretty naive about it. But actually, things in many ways did get a lot better. Things like civil rights and certainly economically, I was better off than my parents were, and they were better off than their parents were, and so on. So in many ways, it delivered. I mean, there were unintended side effects that people weren't paying attention to much, but there was definitely a trend. And people were worried then about sort of running out of the frontier, but the assumption was that space would be the new frontier. And I know you and I disagree about this, so it'd be worth you're sort of giving your side of this, but
yeah, my feeling is that I can't imagine why anybody would ever want to live on the moon or on Mars or on any other planet. I just can't imagine it. I think it's unthinkably daft idea. We have to be very well adapted to this one and really badly adapted to any of those.
So I think the short-term thinking in that is that you assume that who we are sort of stays the same.
Yes, okay.
And so now that we have...
But how quickly can we evolve?
Well, now that we have the ability, I think one of the big game changers, I think there's a few... We're alive at a very exciting time because we have three big game changers, one of which is globalization. Suddenly that's the whole Earth. We are one world. One of which is computers, obviously. But the other one is synthetic biology. We have the ability to manipulate physically what we are, too. So, while I probably wouldn't want to live on Venus in this body, that I could imagine adapting myself so that I would want to live on certainly Mars. And that Mars, I might just love skiing on Mount Olympus and, going out and having a breath of the fresh Martian atmosphere.
Yes, there are people who have pioneer spirits, I guess, and a lot of them came here, of course. But us who didn't come here.
But don't you think over the kind of 10,000-year time frame, though, we're going to do
Yeah.
things like that?
Yes, in that time frame, I think.
And surely we'll build starships, and there's probably planets out there that are much more Earth-like than Mars is. And even though it takes a long time to get there, you can imagine solving the technical problems. And I don't know.
Yes.
So to me, it does seem pretty inevitable that Earth is just our starting point.
Yes. Now, if I told this story to my daughters, who are both very eco, they would say, that's just an excuse for not dealing with the problems on this planet. We're just going to go and fuck up another one. Excuse me. Sorry.
Well, that's what your daughters would say.
I heard a very nice expression.
It's
the other
okay,
day.
it's in quotes.
It's in quotes. Yes, somebody said, fuck is the duct tape of the English language. But if you think about future people and you try to think of the sort of axes on which they'll dispose their thinking. So throughout the Cold War, theoretically, the discussion that we were having was, should we be communist or should we be capitalists? So that's a discussion that Americans think has been successfully and satisfactorily resolved, but not everybody agrees. But there are lots of similar discussions like that. There's the optimists and there's the pessimists.
Well, there's the planners and the improvisers.
Planners and the
Right.
improvisers, yes. The libertarians and the statists, shall we say, people who believe that as little government as possible is the best thing, and people who believe that government and politics is essential. So there are lots of possible long-term arguments that will go on in the future. And of course, these things aren't exclusive. They cut across each other in funny ways. Sorry.
So do you imagine, so actually, it's kind of an interesting question, because clearly so when I grew up, the we talked about was Americans.
Mm-hmm.
And now, I mean, as I got older, I think a lot of the discussion, the that we talk about, for instance, that has the global warming problem is the whole world.
Mm-hmm.
Or at least, but although, when we talk about responding, it's the West, it's Europe, and it's the rich countries. And, there's maybe another in China, or maybe Africa is another one. Mm-hmm. But they've gotten to be smaller and smaller numbers, sort of bigger units.
Yeah.
And so the question is, are we ever going to get to the point where there's a single world that we sort of all feel, or do these axes sort of necessarily imply a division?
Yes, I think that there's a sort of basic engine within humans to create a distinction always, so that as soon as there is something that seems to be consolidating into a single vision, there's going to be power and distinction in making another one in opposition to it.
So I agree with that, but I think one of the things that's changed is it used to be that we sort of did the thing by connecting it to a piece of territory.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was really the people that grew up around you tended to have a similar religion as yours. They tended to eat similar foods.
Yeah.
They had a similar political framework. And so when you had these arguments about, say, capitalism versus communism, they were associated with geographic entities, mm-hmm. nation states. Mm-hmm. And nation states were ways of organizing things around physical borders. And so that you did everything in one place. So in France, you spoke French and you ate French food and mm-hmm. you had French culture and French politics and so on.
Yeah.
And obviously to me, we're moving away from that as the only organizing principle. Mm-hmm. So do you imagine even nation states are going to be around thousands of years from now?
Well, I think that's a really interesting question, because they now have a very serious competitor anyway in the form of corporations. We now have corporations that are international and that sort of dispose themselves at will across nation states of their choice. And they're becoming very powerful, as everybody knows, as sort of governmental forces as well, in that they can make governments behave to a certain extent how they want.
So there's a kind of natural tendency of things to organize themselves into larger units, like, for instance, single-cell organisms organizing themselves into multi-cell organisms, or people organizing into societies. And it's kind of, I think, a trend of information processing.
Yeah.
It just does that. And I used to wonder what it would feel like to be kind of, if we were the single cells of kind of this group mind emerging. And one of the things I realized about it is, one thing about it is it wouldn't necessarily have exactly the same goals as you. And you would influence it, but it would sort of seem to have a life of its own. And actually, I think that's sort of what corporations feel like. That really they don't have the same goals as any of the people. In some sense, they have the goals of the employees, or the goals of the owners, or the goals of the customers, or the goals, kind of a mix of all of those people influence what the corporation does. But in a very real sense, the corporation is a kind of a group mind that has a will of its own that may be different than the wills of any of the people in it.
But don't you think also that just as there's a tendency for things to agglomerate and become bigger and bigger and bigger, there's also there's still always an advantage to the small, fast unit, because the things that become bigger and bigger and bigger tend to become slower and slower as well. They have much more inertia. They can't change quickly. So they can control a lot of things, but they don't deal with the future as well as...
That's true, but now we have a different way of doing things, because now we can be parts of lots of different things. So I can be part of many, I don't want to call them communities because they're sort of one-dimensional.
Yeah.
But in some sense, I can be part of Long Now, and I could also have a religion, or I could also be a part of a certain scientific community. And those are ways of kind of fractionating, but I'm fractionating me. So I'm saying I'm not making the community smaller. Each of those can be very big communities. And I'm not sure our brains are really designed that way. Brains are clearly more designed for the small village of a few, the tribe.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah. Well, and certainly we seem to always want to put things together into that small number that we can handle.
And in fact, if you look at tribes, I think if you're anthropologists that have studied modern tribes, see that there's this thing that happens once you get a group that gets more than about 200 people, it does tend to split off. Some division develops within the group, and it sort of splits, and almost like...
Yeah. Well, there was a very interesting survey done by this German magazine called Der Stern about 25 years ago. Der Stern interviewed people in 38 countries, quite a large sample in each of those countries, and a well-chosen sample. And they asked them a couple of very simple questions. They said, are you happy? And do you think your life will be fulfilled? And the two countries, well, of the list of 38, the country that came bottom was West Germany, which at that time was the richest economic power, or the most thriving in the world, actually. It was really doing very well at that point in time. The countries that came top were Northern Ireland and South Africa. Northern Ireland was in the middle of just about the worst IRA period, and South Africa was in the middle of the apartheid struggles. And De Stern was having trouble trying to explain what this result. It seemed very anomalous. But it occurred to me that perhaps what people really value is knowing who their friends and enemies are. There's a certain security in knowing perfectly well that this person's on your side and you really need each other, and those people aren't. Of course, the West Germans were the most ambiguous of all people in that respect, because they didn't dare have any enemies. They were so embarrassed by their past that they wouldn't take a stand against anybody.
So does the enemy have to be another set of people, or could it be an external challenge?
Well, I think it could be an external challenge, and I think it has been sometimes in the past, that people have suddenly stood against something. And it may be, again, that will happen with, our response to climate change, that perhaps if things get really bad, we'll suddenly realize that we have a real enemy. I mean, states...
Or maybe the Martians will invade.
Yes. Well, states like to have enemies in a certain respect, because if you have an enemy, you're allowed to have a command economy. And even democratic states would secretly like to have a command economy. It's much easier to run things. And so
that feels to me like, I think it's true of the history of the world, but I bet it's not true of the future of the world. So I think we're already starting to organize things in different ways other than by enemy.
Mm-hmm. I hope so,
yeah.
Yes, yeah.
And I think...
what do you think are those ways?
Well, actually, so I think that there's a kind of international culture that is a kind of global culture. And then there is fundamentalism of all sorts, is the enemy, or the people that are organizing themselves by that being the enemy.
Yes, what we call the switch-it-offists.
Yeah. So
these are the people who want to switch it off.
Yeah, so if you're a fundamentalist Christian or Muslim, and you really believe that you've got it down the way the world should be, then in fact that kind of international global culture really is a real threat to the way that you think life should be lived.
Yeah.
And it is the enemy. So that becomes an organizing principle for those people.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we're in a time, I think, where we have the islands of people who have and very effectively organized themselves against the enemy of global culture. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And maybe, I guess, global culture hasn't so effectively organized itself, and yet it does seem to be thriving, I think.
Well, it seems to absorb all its enemies quite easily.
Yeah,
it thrives by just being tempting.
The Borg.
Yeah, it's a nice alternative.
Well, that's actually another possible view of the future, sort of from science fiction, is that we do somehow merge together in some world mind that doesn't have any enemies, and the Borg thing in Star Trek, which I always felt
what is it? The
Borg, yes.
The Borg.
The Borg. Yes, they were.
The singer, Bjork. Is she in Star Trek, is she? Oh, I've got to see that one.
He knows what I'm talking about. And, but, it's a little bit, of course, that's meant to be a horrifying idea, but in some sense, they seem sort of happy.
Yes. The villains always seem to have quite a good time, doesn't it? That's what they say in Ireland, the devil gets all the good songs.
But they're not really even villains if you sort of think that, they sort of like this group mind. They're more missionaries, right?
Yes, yes. Well, of course, the concept of villainy is also very interesting. As we discover more and more that people's behavior is kind of the result of how they're built. Men with double Y chromosomes are much more likely to be violent. And in fact, prison populations have sort of 20 times the number of double Y chromosome people in the prisons than outside of the prisons. So I kind of wonder about that, whether we find out that more and more the things that we have in the past criminalized are simply the result of whatever chemicals you happen to have running around in you, no fault of your own. So what happens then to the idea of justice or legal sanction of some kind? Do we just think, well, poor guy, he's bound to be violent, let's build him a nice place where he won't hurt anybody, but he won't be punished? Is that a future, do you think, that we stop thinking of good people and bad people, or good and bad things at all. And we simply think of things that we want to avoid and things that we want to embrace.
Yeah, I guess, for example, one thing, the chemicals running around in you won't be no fault of your own.
In the future.
Because you'll have
a choice.
You'll
yes.
have choice of it. You'll have control of it.
Mm-hmm. Well, in one future.
In one future,
yeah.
yeah. I think, but I don't know. I don't. I mean, I think there are some. Certainly, there are sociopaths and things like that. But I guess I believe less and less in kind of good people and bad people in normal life. I mean, extremes aside, mentally ill people aside. I think there are people that have ideas that are in conflict with your ideas and goals that are in conflict with your goals. And so ultimately, I think a lot of a successful society is in finding a sort of system for dealing with those conflicts, a political system. So I think probably a lot of designing the future is designing the political system of the future.
Which, of course, is not a popular pursuit in this part of the world.
No, it's something people have almost given up on. I
Yeah.
think it's people assume that democracy is the one person, one vote is the be all and end all of political systems, and I think it's actually.
I think further than that, people in California, in particular, assume that politics is no longer really at all cool to even think about. That it's sort of. It's an old story. It's an old argument.
The discussion of politics it comes down to sort of almost gossip about people. It's personality of the people that are doing things, but there's almost no discussion about the actual structure of the political system.
Yeah.
And yet it's clear that that's why it's not working. It's not. I mean, you could put really probably the best people in the world into the current system that we have, and they would almost certainly act badly. Because they would have to stay in office. So somehow we've constructed a system. If you go back to Tocqueville, which I know you're a fan of too, or actually go back to the Federalist Papers. The thing people were really worried about in the early days of American democracy was the tyranny of the majority. And with the fear that 51% of the people would impose their will on 49%. But actually what's happened, partly because of corporations and partly because of concentrations of wealth, is the tyranny of the minority. It's people who have special interests and have some ability to get votes either by arousing emotions or spending money. That you can basically get a law passed that is bad for almost everybody but good for you, as long as it's just a little bit bad for everybody.
Yeah.
And so we have a political system now where that's really the norm. Almost every piece of legislation that gets passed really is compromised by that effect. And I don't hear much serious discussion about how we could build a different system where that didn't happen in a world that does have corporations and does have very wealthy people.
Yeah. Well, yes. In a world that doesn't assume we're going to just push it all away and start again, which isn't going to happen. We don't have the option of starting from scratch, so we have to start from here. But so
we've agreed with Stuart that when we have about 10 minutes left, he's going to cue us, and I think that
might have been it.
Because there was one thing we wanted to be sure that we got to talk about, which was how the bells work.
Oh yes.
The chimes. Right. And so that's our 10-minute signal to talk about those. But
I better put this on.
When I first came to Brian, even before the foundation started, and said, "Hey, I'm building this clock. Would you help me figure out what sound it should make when it chimes?" Brian discovered this remarkable. He was thinking about it and said, "Well, clearly make a different chime every time it.
Yeah, so we're talking about 10,000 years, and I realized that if you had 10 bells, there were about the number of permutations of 10 bells as there are days in 10,000 years. It's 3,628,800 permutations of 10 bells. So I thought, oh, that would be lovely if you had 10 bells and every single day in those 10,000 years has its unique peal. And so we worked on that basis, and I asked Danny if he could come up with an algorithm that would generate those 10,000 unique permutations. 3,628,800 permutations. So he came up with an algorithm, which he will tell you about, and
Yeah. And in fact, it's the mechanism in the clock, and you saw pictures of this earlier.
Sorry, I need to put another light
Can
on
we
here.
see that? I think, yeah.
Upper.
I knew we shouldn't push buttons.
Can you see that?
Okay, well, that's a little counter in the clock. Actually, let's try, let me just describe the algorithm. That's
It's very high-tech stuff here. We're right at the cutting edge of...
okay. So imagine that 10 bells are going to ring. So you sort of have 10 positions, which I've illustrated by 10 circles. So there's the first bell, the second bell, and so on. And what you want is every combination, every sequence of bells to happen in 10,000 years. So let's say our first bell, which happens to be the C bell, which is boom, boom, is right. Let's say it's in the third position. So what we want to do is we'll leave that in the third position for, say, 1,000 years. And then after 1,000 years, we move it to the next position. And then after 1,000 years, we move it to the next position,
Yeah.
and so on. So you can see over 10,000 years, it gets to be in every position. And then what we'll do is we'll take the next bell, the D bell, and it has 8 places, it has 9 places
Yeah.
to be. So we move it through each of those 9 positions during that 1,000 years. So about once, a little bit more than once a century, it will move. And then the E bell has 8 positions, and it will move through those about once a decade. So it will, and then so on. So each bell moves more rapidly. And so by the time you get to the last couple of bells, the last position is moving every day. So actually, this is a nice picture. This is Brian's album cover, but you can kind of see.
So we worked out this is the peal of bells for the month of January, 7003. So each color represents a bell.
So you can see that these bells stay in the same position, and actually this, I think, would be the C bell. But you know, the higher bells are moving around in position. In fact, the 2 highest bells always change position every day. And so what you need to do is basically count through. So the one bell has to count through 10 different possible positions. The next bell has to count through 9 different possible positions. The next one counts through 8, and so on. So what these mechanisms that you see in the clock are, this is just one of them, are counters. Actually, maybe show the little physical model is a better thing. So for instance, this would be the bell that has to count through 6 different positions would have a little thing in it like this. And so every time the bell that counts through 5 positions counts through all 5, it rotates around and advances that counter. And then there would be another one. This would be connected to one that had 7 positions, and that would be connected to one that had 8 positions, and so on. So that's the basic mechanism that's there inside the clock. And it produces the sequence that the clock actually plays. And of course, the clock will only play one thing in the sequence every time you visit it at noon. So if you climb up to the mountain and go inside the mountain, if you're there at noon, you'll hear the sequence of 10 bells. But can we play the?
Yes, well, we should tell them actually that this isn't fictional. This actually does exist now. This is being built,
Yeah. These things are about 8 feet in diameter in the real thing. So
Not plastic, no.
they're made of stainless steel and titanium and things like that.
What? They'll last 10,000 years. They should do. I mean, stainless steel is pretty durable, isn't it?
Yeah. It really ought to last for 10,000 years. Every part of the clock that moves, for example, we've tested the motion of it for 10,000 years worth of motion. So the part that moves most often is, for instance, the pendulum escapement, but the bearings inside of it, things like that. So we've really tested all of those things, and unless somebody comes and deliberately destroys it, it will last 10,000 years and keep going and still have the correct time after 10,000 years. And every day, if you actually go to the trouble of going out to the desert and climbing up the mountain and going through those tunnels that you saw on the slides made, and climb up the spiral staircase that's cut into the shaft and go past the machinery and climb up into the clock chamber at noon, then when the sun goes overhead at noon, the light will shine into the clock chamber and will adjust itself for noon, and then the chimes will come on.
So this, just to explain briefly before we play this, these are not bells, they're synthesized bells. And I was experimenting with the idea of making bells with particular properties that most bells don't really have. And in fact, since doing this, we have found a bell maker who is making bells with very unusual properties. He can specify the sets of harmonics that they have. So what you're about to hear doesn't really sound like any bells you've ever heard before, and probably doesn't sound like any bells that will ever exist. It's more a sort of proof of concept of this idea of permutating 10 bells. So maybe you could play that, please.
Stuart, do you have some questions for us?
This is for sale in the lobby, by the way. And all proceeds benefit Long Now Foundation. So these are questions from the audience, as filtered by
I
Stuart.
was going through, looking for kind of a rowdy one, because this has been a little sacred sounding lately. Here's a rowdy one. Either one of you can answer it. I can't tell if it's runes or hieroglyphs or what.
We need that on the document camera. It's a piece of art.
There you go. So actually, one question we had from Kevin Kelly, you guys have been collaborating and conversing and having these road trips for quite a while now. And a legitimate question is, what have you learned from each other in a sense, generically. As Kevin asked, Danny, are you more artistic from collaborating with an artist?
He
And
can
Brian, are
sing
you
now.
more, quote, scientific from collaborating with a scientist and inventor?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, one of the things that Danny asked a very interesting question a few years ago, which was one that had been bothering me as well. He was asked by John Brockman to, as were a number of other people, to come up with the question that most interested him as a scientist. And he said, why do people do music? And if you think about that question, that's a profoundly interesting question. Why on earth would we bother to do this? Or painting, or any of the other things. But music is a very mysterious art in general. It's very mysterious. Why we would bother to get excited about one color against another or one sound against another? So we've talked about that quite a lot. Meanwhile, when we're driving around, we play records a lot, and Danny has discovered that he can sing, which he never knew before. In fact, I tried to, well, to some extent, I had some success in teaching him how to sing a cappella gospel.
Which I will not do now, don't worry. But, but actually I was going to not use that example, but something that fits in with that, which is, there's a kind of attitude about the world, about being in the present, which I've learned from you. I've always been very much in the future in my mind, always thinking about the next thing and so on. And one of the things that you do very often is you will just stop. We'll stop by the side of the road, and you'll see, some crumpled up piece of metal that's lying there or something like that, and you'll just get fascinated by how the shadows are falling on it, or we'll spend 15 minutes there looking at it from different angles, and or a sound that you hear, a transformer making or something like that. And it made me realize that how little I wasn't in my own body, in my own senses. I think this is partly what an engineering training teaches you to do, is sort of abstract away from that and not actually. And so I think if I've looked, even the design of the clock, I've really shifted in thinking about where the important things were, because even though I kind of wanted it to be about a conversation from the beginning, mostly I thought about the kind of mechanical things. How would it work? How would the materials last for 10,000 years? Things like that. And I think more and more I've thought about the important part of it is what's the experience, what's the feel of it, and that's kind of a new way of thinking.
Yeah.
I think this question is one piece of, in a way, maybe every 10 years, Long and L sort of check in publicly with itself and the world. How are we doing? What's going on? What's changed over this period of time? And so far, it's just the same set of people, by and large, who were around 10 or 20 years ago. But we aren't the same people anymore. And a fair question to ask both of you now, 20 years older, and 20 years of actually, astonishingly, two easily bored people bearing down on the same set of design questions and framings. What's changed over that period of time? You came to this with beginner's mind 20 years ago. Well, you don't have beginner's mind now. You have some other mind about this. What can you say about what's the difference is?
As Mao said when he was asked what he thought about the French Revolution, it's a bit too soon to say. And it does seem a little bit...
We'll do them every 100 years. I got it. The 10 years
It does seem a little bit like that. No, all I know now is that this conversation is one that I'm having quite a lot of the time with myself. So the idea of the future is a much longer idea than it used to be. You know, the future for me used to be a decade or 2 decades, I might think ahead. And now I often hear people talking about things and I think, yeah, that's true for 10 years, maybe 20 years, but what about 100? What about 1,000 years? So I think there has been a genuine extension. And I also...
Is that symmetrical? Is the past, the deeper past, present
Well, that
for you
might
as well?
also, that might be symmetrical, actually, because I have also become much more interested in the deep past as well. You know, I think at least 50% of what I read is history, essentially.
Same here.
Yeah.
How about Denny? Are you reaching forward, farther, back farther?
I certainly, about half of what I read is history. That's true. Certainly, it gives me a different perspective when I see something. I mean, you know, when I visited, you know, the mayor's great, the Getty, you know, I visited and saw this beautiful new building and thought, wow, this will make great rubble.
Albert Speer was ordered to design that way by Adolf Hitler.
Well,
Designed for the rubble.
Designed for great rubble. Yes, it was the 1,000-year Reich.
Yeah.
So how are we different than that?
So I think, again, I mean, maybe the one thing I've learned about long-term thinking is the difference between long-term planning and long-term thinking.
Yeah, say more about that. My sense is we learned that at Yucca Mountain.
Yeah. The Yucca Mountain's a great example. So I guess I don't really believe in long-term planning, which is trying to take a long distance out and control the future for a long distance. So many of our attempts to look at, for instance, nuclear waste disposal are things where you basically try to control the situation for 10,000 years.
Right.
And in some sense, Yucca Mountain is sold as that. But Yucca Mountain, I actually think, is a pretty good idea because everything is just sitting there in a can, and within 100 years, people will go in and get those and mine them for, you know, it's reversible. So it's really just a 100-year solution, but that gives you a lot of options for what to do in 100 years. And so I've started realizing the right...
By the way, it's a lot more politically tractable.
Yeah.
To say we're just going to park it here for 100 years
Right,
and think about it.
That's right. And that's indeed where we're heading by default, a less good 100-year solution. But the idea of creating options seems to be much more valuable than making really long-term plans.
Yes, but the resistance to that, of course, is that people feel secure with long-term plans, and people don't feel secure with the idea that we'll always be improvising, which I think is something that we have started to come to accept more and more. I mean, I'm just talking about...
Okay, so the hacker ethic was to try to make everybody into a hacker, capable of the maker movement is doing the same thing, make everybody into a maker. And in a sense, you would like to democratize with your acapella and everything else, you're helping make lots of people be artists, helping people be inventors. As more and more people are comfortable being that kind of creative, does this kind of improvisational comfort come with it?
Yes, well, I would hope so. I think it certainly is a trend that I'm seeing. I mean, actually, the very interesting book came out in England. I sent you a copy, but it hasn't arrived yet. It's by a historian called David Runciman, and it's called The Confidence Trap. And it's about, picks up from de Tocqueville and talks about democracy and how the sort of take-home from the book is that democracy is by nature messy and improvisatory. And the problems we always have with it is that people don't like messy and improvisatory, so they are very drawn to authoritarian solutions because they look so clear. The trains run on time or whatever, you know. So he says, the trains are never going to run on time. Just get used to it. It's always going to be a mess at the edges, adapting at the edges of its competence.
So I think one thing that becomes clear when you look back at history is that there are kind of three different ways that people look at how time evolves and how progress happens. And they shift in importance and dominance during different periods. So, for example, in the West during the Dark Ages, that time was thought of as very cyclic, that you didn't expect things to be different 1,000 years from now. They were pretty much the same as they were for your parents and your parents' parents, and that was the expectation.
There's a wheel of fate. You do well, but you're going to be crushed by it pretty soon.
So there was just a regular circle. Hinduism, it kind of has that idea built into it.
Okay.
It just things go around in circles, and your job in a world like that is to kind of get with the program and be part of the cycle, fit in. And then there's another kind of view of time, which is the one that I think has been dominant during most of our lifetimes in
The arrow
in the
of
United
progress.
States, the arrow of progress. That's right. We're doing something. So, if the cycle is the kind of the picture is, and interesting enough, the music of that time was kind of these cyclical, and the music that sort of corresponds to the arrow of progress is kind of the symphony. Because everything's under control and it has a beginning and it's heading toward a crescendo and it's developing and everybody's following the score and it's heading someplace and it's. The factory is kind of the, you put in all kinds of random stuff and then you get out what you want at the end. So it's all very goal directed and it's the everything's getting better kind of point of view that we had growing up. That we're going to conquer space or we're going to, just bigger and bigger frontiers.
Yes.
And so that's a kind of, and then what happens with that, and that's the sort of illusion of control, and then you start realizing things aren't quite so controlled. And then there's another way of thinking, which is more like jazz, which is the improvisation, and that basically it's not so much that we're heading someplace, and it's not, but we're not going around in circles either.
Right.
We're kind of going with the flow. And your job so that your job in that kind of world is to be responsive, tuned in, paying attention, and I think we're heading into a time where that kind of view of where we are is becoming more the dominant thing. We're heading out of the progress world mindset and into the. Now, I think that the cycle. What happens then is that gets so chaotic that people long for the regularity of the cyclic thing, and then, that begins to rise.
Question from Tanya Petenjian. Our greatest fear is, so to speak, how finite our time is. How does the clock counteract that sense of an ending, and does it help relinquish, assuage, or recontextualize that fear?
That's a very nice question. I think
Death.
that would be wonderful if that's what happened. But I think it does in a way. I think that if you, the origin of that phrase, the long now, which was an idea that I had years ago from when I lived in New York. It was really noticing that in New York, where I happened to live, which was downtown in then edgy Soho, before the bankers moved in, people lived in a very, very confined sense of both here and now. So when they said here, they meant these few blocks. They didn't mean New York City or America. They meant this little area. Their sense of here was very small, and their sense of now was very brief. Now for them meant from the end of last week to the end of this week, sort of thing. And I was thinking how a lot of societies have much, much, much more extended sense of now. They think of now, your actions now, resonating into the distant future, and the things you do now being the consequence of things in the distant past. So one of the nice things about that way of thinking which, by the way, isn't the only way of thinking, and it isn't necessarily the best way. It's an alternative. But one of the nice things about it is that you diminish in importance to some extent. Your life is not the primary event in the universe any longer. And I think that's very consoling, actually. I think that death is not such a terrifying thought if life is not if your life is not quite so precious and the star feature of everything.
So you both diminish and you also become much bigger because you see yourself as kind of a thread in something much larger.
Yes.
So, I think I do see myself much more than I ever did as just a little thread in this story of human existence that does go over, many millennia. It's gone over, 10,000. Certainly, it's been going for 10,000 years, and I believe it will go for 10,000 more. So you feel a part of something bigger. In some sense, the fact that you're only a little thread of that becomes less important.
Yeah, you're both talking like old men.
We are.
Yeah, speaking as an even older man, I recognize the rap. So, in relation to that, Cameron Asadi asks, if you were to explain long now to a child, what would you say? What would you want the child to know about the long now in a sense of time? You both have kids. They've been around while you guys have been playing this stuff out. And you've seen them be amused or bored or whatever by it. And you've also, you've both encountered public dealing, or ages of public dealing with this stuff. What connects, if anything, with the very young?
Well, of course, I never explain anything like that to my daughters, because one of the surest ways of turning kids away from something is to enthusiastically endorse it in their presence. I always enthusiastically endorse things like hard
you don't
drugs
explain it to a child. Okay, that makes sense. Danny, you fuck up your kids then? Excuse me, I used duct tape there.
I think my kids are just more engaged in the fun of the activity of actually building the clock. And,
right.
And to tell you the truth, I think that's mostly how I'm engaged in it, too. So, these moments to sort of step back and decide what it all means and so on, or not the normal thing.
Right.
The normal thing is just sort of getting in there and doing it.
Okay, so that's great. You're basically on a 20-year track that got set a long time ago, and the fun is playing it out. And of course, we're already starting to amuse ourselves.
Right.
What the hell are we going to do in Nevada after the Texas clock is built?
Right, and then we get in these situations like this where you ask us like, why are you doing it and where you're heading, and then we have to sort of make up answers.
Have to come up with an alibi.
Right.
Question from Alex for Danny. In the past, you've talked about the future getting closer with every year before the year 2000. And this is when you notice that the future shrinking, that set you in the process of, as an engineer, trying to solve the problem. Do you see new horizons forming for society to imagine the long now? So it was the year 2000 for a long time. What's it now, if anything, and should it be anything? It really was the year 2000.
Right.
I was
That was
there.
a big
I was a
mental
professional
barrier for
futurist,
people.
and you couldn't get anybody to talk about
Yeah.
2003. It just was, actually, it was a film. 2001.
I don't sense another natural barrier coming up.
Great.
I think that the global warming thing, though, is everybody's sort of fear of the end in some sense. And I don't think people think past that.
Okay.
So I think, and so there's a time scale that's sort of set by that's a few centuries. And I do hear people now talking about that time scale.
Yeah, I've done that too. It's a century-sized problem, blah, blah.
Right. I don't hear people talking much past that time scale of with the assumption that we get that solved much. So that maybe is setting the bound of the current conversation.
What do you hear, Brian?
Well, I hear quite a few people talking about the singularity as though it
There was
is
a question
something
about
that's
that,
going
so
to
go ahead.
happen. And I'm agnostic about it. I sort of doubt that it's going to happen because, again, I think we'll muddle along in the same mess that we always have done, and if it does happen, we won't notice it, really. It'll just happen and we'll carry on. You know, maybe it has happened, actually.
Maybe it didn't notice us.
Yes.
You think what?
Two ships,
maybe it
ships
has
passing in the
right.
night.
It has happened, and it did not notice us. Right.
That's right in there with George Dyson's, there are aliens and they're already here, they're just very small. In fact, yeah, that's where the singularity went, is into these very little creatures. Julie Hammond asks, could you share about a challenge or problem you've had in your life that presented an urgent problem, yet you approached it over a lengthy period of time with a long time frame about it? Have you done long-term thinking about any personal problems?
A personal problem.
Or a problem that you took personally. You don't have to go completely soap opera here, but something.
I mean, of course, every day I do it in designing the clock. I mean, I have.
Right.
Right. So, you know, I ran into the Y10K bug in Microsoft Excel the other day.
Explain that. There will be Microsoft stories for the next 10,000 years.
No, it just doesn't handle 5-digit year numbers, it turns out.
How did this express itself?
Well, I was building a spreadsheet calculating the position various gears would be in different times and crashed, it did it wrong. So I think in the design of the clock, certainly every day I run into specific things. I mean, for example, the global warming, which is kind of this abstract discussion. If you're designing the synchronization system for the clock, where the sun shines down the hole and lights up, you actually have to be able to calculate the altitude of the sun, which means knowing what day it is a certain amount of time from now, which means knowing how fast the Earth is spinning. And if the Earth warms and the polar ice caps melt, it actually makes a significant difference in how fast the Earth is turning.
Yeah.
And so you have to build actually a correction system into the clock because of global warming that actually takes into account the possibility of maybe the ice caps will melt and maybe they won't. So
that was the question
that's
from
the question.
Ben Morrow.
What kind of climate change will the clock withstand? And so the answer is it will withstand melting the polar ice caps.
It's very high. It's 6,000 feet up.
Yep. It will.
The one in Texas is 6,000 feet?
Yeah.
Great. Okay, no problem.
And it's designed to, for example, handle big changing weather patterns. It doesn't need a sunny day except once every 10 years or so. So it is designed with the assumption that there will be things like volcanic eruptions, that you don't get a clear sky for 10 years. It is designed to assume that the average temperature may get hotter or colder in the area that it is. Rain, we're designing it in a desert, but it may get a lot more rainfall, so we're taking that into account.
So this is pretty pedagogic. It's rather wonderful in a way. The clock, by dealing with these problems, then invites the people who think about the clock now or visit the clock in a while to engage basically the design process that you had to go through of thinking what kind of stuff happens over the long term, and then how do you invent
we are literally right now talking to the climatology community, asking for weather predictions under climate change scenarios for the spot where we're building the clock.
What are you getting?
We're getting people who have speculations, or things that could happen. Nobody's willing to say this will happen, but we're trying to get the range of things that people are saying could happen.
Okay. Mr. Eno is a Zen Buddhist. How do you
I'm
reconcile the aims of the 10,000-year clock project with the Buddhist notion of impermanence, asks Eric Schneider.
I'm actually not a Zen Buddhist, but
Well, so much for that.
I'm not embarrassed to be described as one, but
What are you, actually? Do you have any belief structure, whatever? I mean,
that sounds like an accusation, Stuart.
well, just checking.
No, I don't think I do, actually. I think I'm
You're an atheist.
somebody who believes in the muddle.
The muddle.
I'm a muddleist. I more and more think that things just muddle along. Nearly everything just
Are
muddles
there
along.
rituals that muddlers?
Muddlers like me surrender to the muddle and love the process of surrendering to the muddle.
Say more about surrender, Brian Eno.
Well, surrender, yes, that's a subject that I'm very keen on. Shall I talk about that or Zen Buddhism?
Surrender. But you're not totally unrelated, but go ahead.
No,
what have you got on surrender?
I'm sure I can find a way to tie my answer to this question. It's an old interviewee's trick. So I suppose I started making the kind of art that you saw before we came in, of these big light installations, and the kind of music I've been making for a long time sort of suggests to people that they should just let it happen to them, that they should surrender to it. And indeed, the kind of behavior I see in my shows, my visual shows, is of people slumped in chairs in a semi-comatose state. And that's actually the state I like to be in as well. I'm very happy in that state. And I thought about this, and I thought, why do we like doing this? Because clearly a lot of people do like doing it. They come not only to my shows, but they do lots of other things that involve surrender, like they go to churches, or they go to parks, or they sit by rivers where nothing much is happening, or they have sex with each other and surrender to that experience, or they take drugs, and that's a kind of surrender as well, you know. So I started thinking there's this kind of umbrella, which I call surrender, and underneath it, under the umbrella, are sex, drugs, art, and religion, at least, and a few other things as well. Those are all activities in which you deliberately lose yourself. You stop being you, and you let yourself become part of something else. You surrender control of some things. And of course, this is a big theme in Zen Buddhism, as you know. But it is, actually. No, the idea being that, you know, we've had about 5,000 years of increasing technical control, and we pride ourselves quite naturally and quite reasonably on the fact that we are very good at control. And of course, we all enjoy the consequences of it, you know, the results of it. On the other hand, we had about 2 or 4 million years of mostly having to surrender, mostly having to go with the flow of things, and mostly having to learn to deal with whatever was thrown up by nature and the surroundings. And I think surrendering is a great gift that human beings have. And I think that one of the experiences of art is relearning or rehearsing or continually trying again to be able to surrender properly, to be able to let things be out of our control and to live with them. And I suppose that one of the things about the idea of thinking in terms of very long periods of time is what I was saying earlier, of losing that sense of yourself as the single focus of the universe's existence, and seeing yourself as surrendering to the idea of being one small dot on this long line reaching out to the edges of time in each direction. Is that anything about Zen? I think that did it.
Danny, are there any elements of a surrender you're trying to build in for the experiencer of the clock in the mountain?
Well, I guess I've come to increasingly appreciate that. Maybe that's what I was saying of what I've learned from Brian, because I think when I was trying to say of sort of the be in the moment, accept being an engineer, I'm normally in the mode of not surrendering and fighting it and trying to wrestle it into the thing you want it to be. And so for me, being able to get out of that mode, which is I do think the mode that you're in when you're looking at the crumpled up piece of metal down on the road,
Yeah,
is you're not trying to get it to be anything.
that's right. Yeah.
You're just trying to take it for what it is.
And yet,
And
so you're using this consciousness to design a place which will be dark and out of time and scary.
well, so exactly. So there are some specific things to try to get you to do that kind of surrender. So, for instance, one of the things it does is that first of all, it forces you to get away from your environment for a long time. By being far away, you have to spend a couple of days just getting there. And then it forces you, by where it is on the mountain, to wake up really early, so you're sleep deprived and you're waking up before dawn to get up to the mountain before noon. And then you go through this physical exertion. You know, climbing up that mountain is not easy. And also, it deliberately gets you into kind of a state of confusion, a little bit of fear, really, of maybe thinking you're in the wrong place, maybe. All of that's really to get you to leave behind all that idea of, you know, your plan, your control, it's meant to, in some sense, get you to surrender. I mean, I'd never really thought of it that way before, but to get you to give up on the idea that you're in control of the situation. And then that all sets you up for, the moment when you get to the clock and hear
Well,
the
there's some
chimes.
scary things that happen along the way, as I recall, is sort of overhearing some of the design conversations, like this 300-foot spiral staircase that's cut in living rock. As I recall, as you go up, the stairs get narrower and narrower.
Right.
What's that about?
Well, that's again putting some sense that, okay, so for example, one of the things it does is you go up that staircase, and so when you're at the top looking up there, you think you know where you're going because there's some light, literally a light at the end of the tunnel, which you're heading up toward.
Right.
But as you get up there, the stairs get smaller and smaller. In fact, eventually they taper off to so small you couldn't possibly walk on them. And so you sort of see that coming up and you realize, oh, my plan isn't going to work. Right. And so that's an example. And then, at some point, you go off in a different direction. Of course, there are ways forward, but they're different ways than maybe what you were expecting. And so you end up having to get away from that idea of progress and heading toward the light and take a side track. And so those are deliberately designed in to kind of get you out of, maybe kind of fool you into thinking for a minute you have a plan, and then making you realize you don't. You're not in control of the situation.
That's life. We're going to wrap for the evening.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.